Hey, this is just a quick note about our sponsor, Privado, the premier enterprise privacy platform, purpose-built to bridge the gap between privacy and engineering. Its privacy code scanning solution embeds privacy compliance and governance into the product development lifecycle and empowers privacy and security teams with unparalleled visibility of sensitive data flows and the insights to find and fix privacy vulnerabilities. You can leverage Privado's data flows, dynamic data mapping, privacy assessment automation, and real-time visibility of privacy issues. Enter the era of proactive privacy and transform privacy from business blocker to business enabler. To learn more, go to privado.ai. Hello, I am Deborah J. Farber. Welcome to the Shifting Privacy Left podcast, where we talk about embedding privacy by design and default into the engineering function to prevent privacy harms to humans and to prevent dystopia. Each week, we'll bring you unique discussions with global privacy technologists and innovators working at the bleeding edge of privacy research and emerging technologies, standards, business models, and ecosystems. Today, I'm delighted to welcome my next guest, Kim Wuyts, Senior Postdoctoral Researcher at the Distrinet Research Group at the Department of Computer Science at KU Leuven. She has over 15 years of experience in privacy and security engineering and is one of the driving forces behind the development and extension of LINDDUN, a privacy threat modeling framework that provides systematic support to elicit and mitigate privacy threats in software systems. A very warm welcome to you, Kim.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm really excited for you to be here too. I've been wanting to have you on the show for a long time since you're really right in the center of all things threat modeling for privacy engineering. So I've been watching you for a long time. And I know we recently had met up at the RSA Security Conference and had lunch. And so, this has been a long time coming and I can't wait to ask you some meaty questions and that I think our listeners are going to be really interested in. To kick it off, would you mind just giving us an overview of your career journey and how did you get interested in threat modeling in the first place?
Well, I started as a junior researcher doing some research projects, and one of the assignments was do a security analysis. So we looked around and there's this really cool approach called Stride, which was created more than 20 years ago at Microsoft as part of their secure development lifecycle. And that's a security threat modeling approach. And we were applying that, and our privacy colleagues were actually saying, wow, that's really interesting because we don't have something similar for privacy. We also would like to have something systematic and something that has some additional information and additional knowledge. So we kind of joined forces and created a threat modeling approach for privacy. And I've been working in that area and on our LINDDUN Privacy Threat Modeling approach ever since, basically. And actually, in a couple of weeks, I will switch over from academia and after some well-deserved rest, move into some industry positions soon. So another exciting step in the career. Yes.
That's really amazing. That's exciting. I might be asking you a little bit about that later. I'm not sure how much you will be able to reveal. Could you tell us who you're going to be moving to work with?
Well, I'm still checking my options. I'm trying to take some time and basically also just enjoy some relaxed time, some time off after my academic career and diving into some options there. So, well, if anybody is looking for a privacy threat modeling expert, feel free to reach out, I would say.
Well, if anybody is looking for a privacy threat modeling expert, it seems clear to me that you would be like at the top of the list to interview for sure. So that's really exciting. I'm glad you put that call out there. And I'm really also glad to hear you're going to take some time off because you've definitely been working on this stuff for a long time. And, I think taking downtime is essential. So good for you. And it's the summer. So that's lovely.
Yes, absolutely.
So I know you co-authored a while ago a threat modeling manifesto with several other threat modeling researchers. And so I'd love to discuss what is threat modeling generally. When we say this term, what do we mean by threat modeling? Who should be threat modeling? And then what's your philosophy on threat modeling?
So the manifesto definition, and it took us like weeks and weeks of discussions and tweaks to get 15 people to agree on the definition. is analyzing representations of a system to highlight concerns about security and privacy characteristics. In other words, basically, threat modeling means you start thinking about security and privacy early on and start thinking about all the things that can go wrong in your system so you can fix it before it actually happens. So it's really embracing that by design paradigm for security and privacy, really bringing it in early in the development lifecycle.
Love it. And then since it's a threat modeling manifesto, is there a particular philosophy on threat modeling?
Well, so threat modeling we have different approaches, you have different techniques you can apply. But so the essence really boils down to the 4 questions that I mentioned before. It's basically a very simple idea that we do that in our everyday lives. When you leave the house, you think, well, I don't want a burglar to come in. So I think about all the things that can go wrong. Well, they can enter through the door, through the window. So let's make sure I lock everything right up. So that concept of asking ourselves these questions unintentionally, often in our day-to-day activities. And the idea of threat modeling and of this threat modeling manifesto is to make people aware that this is really a fantastic way to do so for security and privacy too, to really embed that in the design, have that reflection on thinking about what can go wrong, because that can help you throughout the development lifecycle, that can introduce new requirements that will increase your security and privacy posture.
Yeah, and I love it, of course, because it definitely meets that shift left trend and need to address privacy and security earlier in the data lifecycle and engineering lifecycle. So how do you see those things working together, threat modeling and shifting left?
Well, I've been discussing this with some of my threat modeling manifesto colleagues as well. I would say that threat modeling can be considered kind of a vehicle for by design, because threat modeling gives you that technique, that approach to really do this in a systematic, in a structured way. And the outcome then again guides you in the subsequent steps of that development lifecycle. It gives you requirements to be implemented in architecture. It gives you input for pen testers to use, because you define what can go wrong, what you want to avoid. So pen testers can use that as input to see whether you actually fix that. So I think it's a great approach that will help you, that will guide you through that by design paradigm.
So would you say that the people who would be responsible for this framework within an organization would be developers themselves? Would it be somebody who's more on like enterprise risk? You say pen testers, so that to me screams typically security. So who within an organization would be the one that you would, or who are the people, maybe it's groups of people that should own the process of privacy threat modeling?
Well, developers are definitely a great target audience there. Architects, analysts. I'm going to quote one of the manifesto patterns, which says you need a varied viewpoint, basically. You should try to get different perspectives around the table. You need to have the developer, the project lead, the privacy expert, the security champion, because, well, first of all, you need to have a good understanding of the system. And typically those people all have kind of different perspectives on that, and getting them together around the table will give you that joint view on the system. And that typically already brings up some interesting discussions like, I didn't know it was done like that. Well, we said so in the documentation, yeah, but we didn't implement it like that. So getting that conversation started is really important there. But of course, you need a facilitator, which is typically then either the privacy expert or a threat modeling expert that will guide that discussion, that will try to get that system model out of that group of people and trigger conversation, trigger brainstorming about what can actually go wrong from a privacy or from a security perspective.
That makes sense. Thank you so much for that. I know under this threat modeling manifesto, before we dive deeper into the privacy threat model framework of LINDDUN, I just wanted to ask you about just basic patterns that benefit threat modeling versus ones that inhibit threat modeling, like best practices versus, things to avoid.
Yeah. Well, I can list a couple because we actually have a list of patterns and anti-patterns in the manifesto. The manifesto is just like a couple of minutes read. Really highly recommended. I know I am biased because I'm one of the authors, but I think it has so much great content there. So a couple of patterns that we described, like the things you should try to look for when you do threat modeling, is have a systematic approach, because if you apply threat modeling in a systematic way, it becomes reproducible. And I think for privacy by design, that's great, because that gives you that kind of accountability that some data protection legislation likes to have, like proving that you actually did this by design because you used this systematic approach. I think that's really valuable for privacy. I mentioned the very few points, get people with different perspectives around the table, and use successful field tested techniques. There's several approaches to privacy threat modeling out there, to security threat modeling out there. But the thing is, there is no one size fits all. So try what works for you specifically, what works for your type of development practice, for your kind of organization, for your specific context or domain. Maybe you benefit more from a quick brainstorm, or maybe you're in a highly regulated domain and you need a very systematic, very formal, very thorough analysis. And then you have all kinds of approaches in between there. And then talking about a couple of anti-patterns, for instance, people work hard on the what are we working on? So trying to come up with the best model to represent the system. But there's this quote by George Box that says, all models are wrong, some are useful. Basically, there is no one perfect representation. Start with what you have, extend with what you need when you are talking about privacy or security. There is no single ideal view. And basically, the more information you have, the more additional representations you have, the better you can start looking at the problems, at the privacy problems or the security problems. And maybe another misconception or anti-pattern is the hero threat modeler. So there is this idea that, well, this sounds like a very difficult thing to do. I will bring in the privacy expert, and that's the only person who can ever do that because, well, they're the expert. But as I mentioned earlier, who should do threat modeling? Well, everybody. So it's not that you need to have this crazy ability, unique mindset. Everybody can and should do that. The goal is to not have that one privacy champion, one privacy expert fixing everything for the entire company, but by creating awareness, by including people in those threat modeling sessions, that people will get to grow in this and embrace this and have that reflection, have that awareness of thinking about privacy, even when they're not in a designated threat modeling session. They can maybe do that later themselves for their own teams.
That's great. I agree with all of that, right? I mean, there's only so much that a singular expert can do. A lot of what we need to do as experts is transfer our knowledge to others to enable them to take, action as part of their own job roles, like in this case, software developers. So huge fan of that and totally agree on that approach. I want to turn our attention to the LINDDUN framework, this threat modeling framework for identifying privacy threats in software systems early in the development lifecycle. I know you've been working on that for years. You're part of the team there. Could you start out with letting us know what the benefits to using LINDDUN are?
Yes, sure. I've been talking about threat modeling now for a while. So threat modeling means you think early about all the things that can go wrong. But thinking about, okay, what can go wrong from a privacy perspective, that's kind of easier said than done, right? You already need to be like a diehard privacy expert to know all the things that can go wrong. So that's where I believe approaches such as LINDDUN have great value, because LINDDUN is actually an acronym, mnemonic, for the different privacy threat categories that need to be tackled. So LINDDUN is a mnemonic for 7 categories, which are linking, identifying, non-repudiation, detecting, data disclosure, unawareness, and non-compliance. And for each of those 7 categories, LINDDUN provides additional guidance in the form of threat trees or threat cards that will help you understand what this actually means, and that will guide your analysis, because you can really go through each of those threat types, threat nodes, to trigger your inspiration and to think about, okay, does this make sense for my system? Where does this apply? If so, well, I found a threat, I need to document and then need to resolve this.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hello, loyal listeners. The Shifting Privacy Left podcast is seeking sponsors who want to help educate our growing community of privacy engineers. Position your brand in front of privacy engineers, architects, developers, researchers, and privacy tech buyers. Insert a 30 to 60 second ad like this one into every published episode of the podcast. This is dynamic content after all. Feature your new product, an upcoming conference, a sponsored special deal, endless opportunities. Email sponsorship@shiftingprivacyleft.com for more information on our sponsorship package. Okay, let's get back to our engaging privacy conversation. I love that. And I was actually going to ask you where LINDDUN, the term, comes from. And I can't even believe I didn't see that. I have the privacy threat types, all 7 of them listed out. And it's an acronym of those privacy threat types. And I just didn't even realize that before you called it out. So thanks for that. Do you mind going through each of them and just giving a high level description of what these privacy threat types are? What does it mean? First one being linking, for instance.
Yes. So linking means, well, you can link different bits and pieces of information together. And so it's about personal information. And obviously, the more of those data items you link together, the more information you can deduce because, well, you start building a profile about individuals. And often this kind of linking leads to the next category, which is identifying, which is actually deducing who that person is. If you don't need to know somebody's social security number or DNA sequence or full name, address, and date of birth to know who that person is. If you would tell somebody in the privacy community maybe that you have been talking to that blonde woman who talks about LINDDUN, these are 3 different items, data items, properties that on themselves don't reveal much. I mean, blonde and woman, that doesn't say much, but by combining those bits and pieces together, you quickly grow a more specific profile. You quickly zoom into a closer anonymity set. And the more you add, the more narrow you can single out a person, and singling out can lead to identifying the natural person. And that's often something you want to avoid from a privacy perspective. Then you have non-repudiation, which especially for the security people is kind of weird, but because for security, non-repudiation is a property you want to achieve. From a privacy perspective, you often want to have plausible deniability, like want to deny who you voted for, want to deny, that you accessed a certain type of system or whatever. So that's something that also ties back to hiding at a claim, something that you did, and hiding attribution, a link to your identity that ties back to that claim. Then we have detecting. Detecting is kind of related to side channel attacks too. Detecting means that even if you don't have access to data, to the system, specifically to information in a flow, you can still deduce some interesting information. An example I like here is when you want to know whether your friend has an account on some sketchy website, you often don't need to hack into the database of user accounts. You can just go to the forget password feature and type in their email address. And then when it replies, well, okay, thank you, we found your email address in the system, you will now receive an email to reset your password. You can just detect that email address is part of the system without actually having access to the database of user accounts. Then we have data disclosure, which ties back to the minimization principle, which I think is one of the core principles for privacy. So don't collect more, don't store more, don't process more than you actually need. Don't collect more specific information, like don't go to fine grains if you don't need it. Don't collect it or don't store it for too long of a time. That's all data disclosure threats. Then we have unawareness and unintervenability, which basically relates to transparency and control. So as a data subject, as an individual, you have the right of knowing what information is being collected about you, why it's being collected, who else has access to it. And often that's forgotten. And in the same way, as an individual, you also have the right to have access to your information to be able to decide who gets access to your information. So that's all in this category. And then the final one is non-compliance. And we, in the latest version, stretched this out a bit. It's not just about data protection compliance. It's really about complying to best practices of relevant domains, because privacy, you can do all these things and de-identify and minimize and all those things. We still rely, for instance, on security, on confidentiality. So this final category tells you that you also need to look at security best practices. You also need to get legal compliance. You need to get a lawyer involved, because legal basis, that's something that you cannot check from a technical perspective. And because privacy is about data, about personal data, data lifecycle management is also something that needs to be tackled properly. So that's the 7 categories in a nutshell. But basically, you can check everything on the website. Everything is freely available on the website, which is linden.org.
Yes, that's an excellent point. All these materials are free and accessible, and I encourage everybody to go take a look at them. So I want to get even go down a few more layers to kind of demonstrate how software engineers can leverage this framework. And I understand that Linden has a concept of privacy threat trees, which aim to refine each threat type into more concrete threat characteristics. Can you explain how privacy threat trees help the threat model?
Yes. So a threat tree basically lists, as you say, the threat characteristics, like the properties that will result in a privacy threat. And by going over all those characteristics in detail, you get a more fine-grained analysis. You get that additional information, because if you're not an expert, well, I can say, well, now think for 10 minutes about linking, then probably many of you would still be like, okay, linking, so, but what do you mean? So this is where the threat trees, or similar, we also have threat cards for the Linden Go approach that contain basically the same knowledge, but in a different representation of information that will help you to facilitate that discussion, to guide that analysis. So for instance, for linking, it tells you that you should look at specifically linked data that can be linked together because all share a unique identifier, which can be a social security number or a username or something. But you can also link data. It becomes linkable data instead of linked data when you can start combining things together through quasi-identifiers. So what I mentioned before, the blonde woman talking about Linden, for instance, these different data items on their own don't really say much, but when you all combine those, then it becomes a quasi-identifier, then it kind of ties back to me. And you can link individuals, but you can also link groups of people, like make profiles about all people who live in a certain neighborhood, because maybe the insurance company wants to know that they have a higher risk of a certain disease and therefore increase their insurance fee. So linking is about tying those bits and pieces of information together and deducing additional information, profiling people, inferring information. And the threat trees will help you to reason about this, because in addition to explaining those different characteristics, the trees and the Linden Go threat cards also contain some examples to help you see, like, what is an example of a direct linking threat.
Yeah, that it would be great to see an example, like if we unpack a little more to demonstrate how the model can assist software engineers and use the particular privacy threat type of linking. Would you be able to explain what some of the concrete threat characteristics, examples, criteria, impact info would be included? Yes.
So one of the characteristics in linking says you can link because you have a unique identifier. That can be, for instance, as I'm now reading from the threat tree of linking, that can be an email address that's used as an ID, or an IP address that's also a unique identifier. It can be that you're logged into a certain website. So a specific user ID can also be a unique identifier. When we then move to another characteristic for linking about linkable data through combinations, through quasi-identifiers, you can, for instance, have a combination of age, gender, and postal code. because those three pieces of information are known to be, I think it was like 90% specific and revealing a unique person. Browser fingerprint is another one. You can assume that you're browsing anonymously, but because of all the information that you share with the backend, the type of browser you use, the fonts you have installed, the font size you are looking at, the languages that are installed on your computer, on your browser, those are all, when combined, so specific that you are actually unique, and that different visits to that same website can be linked to your profile because it can be tied to your specific browser fingerprint. And then we have different examples and criteria to look for the different characteristics as well.
That's super helpful. And thank you for going through that. Because as I was looking through LINDDUN, I thought, wow, I really want to make this conversation clearly demonstrate that there is technical considerations for developers, specifically like looking at what data might be flowing through the organization or, being SDKs and such. And so, I think that was a really helpful elucidation there. Impressively, LINDDUN is not only a framework, that exists, but the team at KU Leuven also created a repeatable process for systemizing threat modeling into the system lifecycle with what they call LINDDUN Pro. Can you tell us a little bit about LINDDUN Pro's methodology and how companies can leverage LINDDUN to meet privacy and data protection by design and privacy engineering goals?
Yes, of course. Yeah, so the idea of now our kind of rebranded LINDDUN methodologies, we now have LINDDUN Pro and LINDDUN Go, and we're working on a third one, which will be LINDDUN Maestro. LINDDUN Pro is actually closely related for the security people to Stride per interaction, which means that it's a very systematic, thorough approach where you typically start from a data flow diagram, which is kind of a simple representation of how information flows through the system. So you have only a couple of building blocks, external entities, which are users or external, third parties, processes, databases, and then flows in between. And what you do for the LINDDUN Pro, for the thorough analysis, is you make this big mapping table where you list all those different interactions, those different elements, components, and then you map them to the LINDDUN categories, and you go over each one by one in a very systematic way. So that mapping table kind of becomes your guide and also becomes your accountability tool, because it will show auditors or whoever that you've gone through this very thoroughly, very systematically. And then for each check in your mapping table, you either identify threats based on the threat trees, or you write down some assumptions saying, well, this doesn't apply because I make this specific assumption. On the other side of the spectrum, because, well, I mentioned before, you have different needs, different requirements from different organizations, different teams. If you don't want that very thorough approach, you can go to a more facilitated brainstorm approach with the LINDDUN Go methodology, where you are more looking at, well, as I said, more facilitated brainstorming, can be even a gamified approach, where instead of a list of threat trees, you use a deck of threat cards that will guide you through this elicitation, this analysis phase, in kind of a similar but less thoroughly documented way, so that the cards are the driver for your analysis, but you don't need to document this big mapping table. It goes a bit faster, but of course then you lose a bit of that accountability because you don't write everything down. But that's useful then for the people who look more for an easier way to get started with privacy threat modeling, a quicker way, a more lean way. So you can kind of see which of those methods, those different approaches fit your specific needs best.
That makes a lot of sense, because I could see how that's a teaching tool, because the cards are kind of almost like a game, right?
Yeah.
And so it's engaging.
Yeah.
Would you say that that would be similar to doing like tabletop exercises, but, and keeping teams ready by playing this threat modeling card game that can help them, apply the right that. Yeah. You think that's kind of akin.
Yeah. Well, LINDDUN Go was inspired by the Elevation of Privilege card game, which is again based on Stride, created by Adam Shostak, a card game. elevation of privilege, and it's a gamified version. So that kind of triggered us like, okay, we want something more lean, something more to support that brainstorming approach. So yeah, you can definitely use it as a tabletop game, but it doesn't have to be a game. You can also just use it as a conversation or analysis facilitator without actually adding like gamified angles, because we also learned from people using it that they say, well, this is great, but we don't like to do this as a game version. We just like to use the inputs, and we're serious people. We don't do gamified stuff. We do serious modeling.
Well, that's good to know. That's really good to know. Okay, don't use it as a game. It's a teaching exercise.
Well, yeah, you can use it as a game or just as a teaching or facilitation resource.
But that is still compelling, and I have a copy, and it is very useful. So I highly recommend the LINDDUN model. How would you say that organizations can combine threat modeling approaches with like privacy enhancing technologies to address privacy risks? Is there an overlap there?
Yeah, so with LINDDUN, we mainly focused on that second question I mentioned for threat modeling. That's what can go wrong. But of course, you want to look at how can we fix this stuff that we found. So we have done some work there. I'm not sure whether it's still on the latest version of the website, but we did some mapping from LINDDUN categories to privacy enhancing technologies. But basically, I would recommend have a look at privacypatterns.eu or privacypatterns.org, or at the Little Blue Book written by Jaap Henk Hoopman, a Dutch professor who wrote about privacy strategies, privacy tactics. And I think those, like looking at more high-level strategies, tactics, patterns, that will help you look for the right direction on how to fix threats. And then you can dive into sets of bets and determine which, the identification technique is best suited for this specific threat. As far as I know, there is still not a very comprehensive overview of like all existing pets out there. That would be really awesome. I know that there's some organizations like ICO that created kind of a catalog on pets. I really hope that we will dive into more like a community work of selecting pets, because there's pets scattered all over, but it's really hard to find a good overview of what is out there. And I think that's really helpful. That should be really helpful for everybody who's looking into actually fixing privacy issues and looking for the right pets.
Yeah, no, I agree. Hey, if you want to co-write that book with me, I'd be glad to work on that topic, because I think there's a huge need. No need to answer right here on air. Okay, on to the next question. You are the program chair for the International Workshop on Privacy Engineering. And I know I'd plug it, but I know it's taking place a week and a half from the day of this recording. By the time most people listen to this, it will have already taken place. I did want to ask you a little more about the conference so people know about it for next year. And then what topics this year are you most excited to hear about?
Yes. So IWPE, or the International Workshop on Privacy Engineering, is a workshop that is organized at EuroSMP, which is the European edition of Security and Privacy, an academic conference. So this is also mainly an academic workshop where we have lots of academics send in their publications and talk about it. We the last couple of years really try to also get some industry people coming in to talk about like, how do we do privacy in our company? How do we do applied privacy engineering? Because I think that's really interesting and important to also bring that to the academic community, and at the same time share that academic knowledge to the broader industry. Well, let me just quickly go through the program. What we have this year is a session on privacy enhancing technologies, which is always really interesting because you always learn new approaches and techniques. Well, it's the privacy engineering workshop. So we have kind of an overall privacy engineering session there, with also a keynote I'm really looking forward to by Jason Kronk, who will talk about, is 2023 the year of the privacy engineer?
Ooh, that's exciting.
Yes, right. We have a session on privacy and society, a session on privacy labels and policies. and a session on privacy threats and threat modeling. So I'm really excited about that session, of course, but I'm biased because of my background and my interest. So I'm really looking forward to that workshop. And well, I hope to see many of you this year or next year.
That's awesome. Will there be publicly accessible links to the talks afterwards that people can tune into?
I'm not sure whether they will be recorded. Typically, we do share like the slide decks, and well, it's an academic conference, so the papers will also be, I think, publicly available. But that kind of depends on the way that the authors have registered it in the system.
Okay, got it. All right. Well, I'll put a link to the conference page, and people can, see what they have access to.
Yes, awesome. Thanks.
As we're closing up here, I just want some of your thoughts on a few things. So, are there any topics on your radar within the privacy engineering world over the next 6 months? Like, there's some interesting blends of tech here where we've got, everyone's talking about AI, everyone's talking about, I don't know if they're talking about metaverse anymore, but there's all these other technological stacks and, privacy engineering cloud. Like, are there any specific areas that stand out for you that you're excited or interested about in learning more about?
Yeah, well, I think AI is like the big one that will need more attention, not just in the next 6 months, but way after that too. I think responsible AI is a really hot topic, and for good reason, because there's so much more to be done there. I know within the threat modeling community, a friend of mine, Isabel Barbera, has also created a threat modeling knowledge base to analyze or to reason about responsible AI, actually inspired by our LINDDUN Go card deck.
Oh, nice.
So even within the threat modeling space, there is some work on that responsible AI. But yeah, I think that's one of the big domains that we need to dive into from a privacy perspective: ethics, trust, responsibility. I think definitely a hot topic to follow. Yes.
Yeah. Let's see. What books, communities, conferences, or other resources would you recommend for listeners to learn more about privacy threat modeling, privacy engineering, or pets?
Yes. So, well, my two favorite privacy conferences are probably the one by IAPP. Well, I only attended the one in Brussels, but I hear great things about the other ones across the globe as well. Every year in Brussels, we also have the CPDP, the Conference on Privacy and Data Protection, which is also a very international conference with lots of great panels and really a lot of big names that come talk there, and that are a great networking opportunity. So yeah, communities, I mentioned IAPP before. Well, there's different people scattered around, and honestly, I get a lot of my privacy input from some people I follow on LinkedIn, like Katharina Körner, who has done some great things for the privacy engineering community at IAPP, Tim Clements, who shares so much interesting stuff on data protection. Yeah, there's so many other people I love to follow. For threat modeling specifically, there is the Threat Modeling Connect community, which is a really open community where people can ask questions, where you get kind of support if you're stuck, where there's lots of seminars to grow in threat modeling. So I think that's also a great resource to have a look at.
Excellent. And is that a Slack group, or is there a website for the...
Yeah, it's a website. I think it's just threatmodelingconnect.org or com. I have to look. Yeah, it's by a bunch of threat modeling experts, and you just have to sign up. You get access to lots of message boards and seminars and all those kinds of things. Actually, a couple of months ago, they even did a threat modeling hackathon, not just about security threat modeling, but also about privacy threat modeling. So privacy has really been part of that community too.
Excellent. And I meant to ask you this before, but what's the adoption like for the LINDDUN model? Is it like slowed for organizations to start incorporating it, or are you seeing it like a real big uptake in using LINDDUN across organizations?
Yeah, so especially since GDPR entered into force, we got a lot more people reaching out like, well, can you help us? How can we use LINDDUN? How can we collaborate? So ever since data protection legislation kind of forced people to start thinking about privacy, we've seen a big uptake. And well, it's both local and international, from startups to very big tech companies, global tech companies, who I am aware that are using LINDDUN or LINDDUN Go. And well, the feedback I got is like, well, even from a big company, they said, well, even we have this budget to kind of create our own stuff, but it's so great that this is such a well-established technique now that we should be silly if we do not use all this knowledge, all these resources, and just integrate them, because they're so useful, and we can still tweak them to our own needs to make it fit. So I'm really excited to see. Also, there's now a couple of ISO on privacy engineering, I think, or was it ISO on privacy by design, that now explicitly mentions the need for privacy threat modeling. The ISO on the identification techniques also mentions privacy threat modeling as an approach to be included. So I really see an uptake of privacy threat modeling within the privacy engineering community. And I think LINDDUN is one of the bigger names there to be applied and included there.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the one that I've definitely heard the most about in my research. And I guess my last question for you before we close is, how can we better bridge the gap between the academic and commercial world when it comes to advancing and deploying PETs, and maybe LINDDUN model as well? I mean, I kind of go hand in hand, because you might deploy the right PET based on threat modeling. I guess that's the question. I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah. We need to bridge that gap, right? And it's not that straightforward because, well, yeah, some academics kind of want to stay in their ivory tower, and then some industry people are saying, like, I don't really care about what's going on in academia. I want like something that I can use right now. So I think academics will need to look not just at foundational research, but also looking at ready-to-market research and really reaching over and handing some things that are usable. I think we are working on things like that because, for instance, we have the LINDDUN Go approach that makes it more lean. We are working on improvements there for the LINDDUN threat trees as well, to make them more understandable, more usable, and the way around as well. So the industry to kind of be open to academic resources. I forgot to mention another conference that I only attended remotely, but still I really liked. It's the Pepper conference. Well, we try to do that for our IWP as well, but I think Pepper is one of the great examples where academics and industry people from the privacy engineering field really come together and have like side-by-side talks about, well, this is some new exciting research we have been doing. And then there's somebody from a big company saying, well, this is how we actually do this in practice. And I think that's wonderful to see that mix of the two worlds coming together and learning from each other, and the academics taking something back, like, for instance, well, okay, this isn't working in practice, so maybe we should go back to the drawing board and start reworking our foundational research. And then industry people saying, well, okay, this seems like an interesting concept. Maybe we can work further with it, and maybe have the researchers join us and work on more the foundational research, and then we apply it in practice and see how that works. So I really think we need to look for ways to bring those together in projects, in company projects, in research projects, and definitely at conferences.
Thank you so much for that. I will put a link to the Pepper conference in the show notes. And Pepper stands for Privacy Engineering Practice and Respect, for those of you who are unfamiliar. And it is a great conference. Any last words before we close for today?
Just an invite for everybody to have a look at threat modeling in general, the Threat Modeling Manifesto, and basically just start including privacy and security early on by design. As basically is the name of this podcast, let's shift left and start working on those concepts early.
Excellent. All right. Well, Kim, thank you so much for joining us today on Shifting Privacy Left to discuss privacy threat modeling and privacy engineering.
Thank you for having me.
Sure, of course. We'll probably have you back in the future to see where you've landed and what you're working on then.
All right. I'll keep you to that.
Until next Tuesday, everyone, when we'll be back with engaging content and another great guest. Thanks for joining us this week on Shifting Privacy Left. Make sure to visit our website, shiftingprivacyleft.com, where you can subscribe to updates so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found this episode valuable, go ahead and share it with a friend. And if you're an engineer who cares passionately about privacy, check out Privado, the developer-friendly privacy platform and sponsor of this show. To learn more, go to privado.ai. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday for a new episode. Bye for now.